Several years ago, Sharon and I went to an event called the Multi-Ethnic Church Roundtable, and it was an event at a church in Charlotte called Transformation Church, looking at how to build a multi-ethnic church and spending some time with them learning about that. But one of the things that they did, the lead pastor there is named Derwin Gray, and we have read some of his books here. We've given out some of his books. But Derwin is a phenomenal leader, preacher, but he also played football in the NFL, and he played for the Colts, he played for the Panthers. And the reason I tell you all of this is because at the end of the weekend, he and his wife Vicky washed everyone's feet who attended this event. And it was just this incredibly humbling moment, but it was also this moment where you're like, if I'd known that this was going to be happening, I would have pre-washed my feet. Like I would have made sure this morning everything was really clean. I would have gold bonded my shoes, I would have prepared for this moment, and so you're kind of like, you know what? You don't really have to do this. I appreciate the gesture, but let's just say we did and not do it, okay? But we get this practice, and maybe you've experienced having your feet washed before, but we get this experience and this practice from the Gospel of John. And that's the story that we are in this week. And one of the things that I love about the Gospels, these four accounts of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is that there is a lot that is similar about these stories, but there's also some things that are unique to each of these Gospels. Some things that each of these authors tell us about Jesus that the others don't. And that's especially true with the Gospel of John. Now, I love the Gospel of John. I love to nerd out on the Gospel of John. I did my dissertation on the Gospel of John. And so we're going to go to some places this week that you may be like, why are we talking about this? But I love to nerd out on John. And so I hope you're ready for that. If you want to take some notes, I always encourage that. But what I love about these Gospels is that, if I and Sharon's parents were to write a story of Sharon's life, an account of Sharon's life, there's a lot that would be similar to our stories, but there would also be some things that would be different. Some things that I experienced that they haven't, or some things that they were impacted by with Sharon that didn't hit me the same way, or that were impactful for me but not for them. And a lot of times with the Gospels, these four accounts of Jesus' life, we can see these unique things as problems that we have to figure out how to reconcile. But I actually think what they do is they give us a more dynamic picture of who Jesus was and who Jesus is. And this week, we're going to look at a couple of things that are unique to John's gospel and how that actually gives us a fuller picture of who Jesus was and what Jesus came to do. We see that in John's gospel, one of the things that is unique is this story of washing the disciples' feet. John is the only author that gives us an account of this. John also does not give us an account of the Lord's Supper, where he breaks the bread and pours the wine. But presumably, these things happened on the same evening. And so why does John tell us this? Why doesn't he tell us about the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine? What is it that John wants us to understand about who Jesus is by telling us this story? Well, just as the other Gospels use the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine as an image of how Jesus would break his body and pour out his blood for us, John, too, is using the events of this evening, different events, to depict for the disciples in dramatic fashion what he was about to do for them, including Judas. Jesus washing the disciples' feet paints a picture for us of what Jesus has done for you and for me. And I want to use this story to illuminate our understanding of what Jesus has done for us. Now, you may be asking, why does this matter? Why does it matter to me what Jesus has done or what he did in this washing of their feet? Why does it matter to me? Well, I think that there's one simple reason why this matters to all of us, and I think it's because all of us are walking around with some kind of dirt on our feet. That dirt may be things that the world tells us about who we are that distorts God's truth about us. It could be things that we believe about ourselves because of our experiences in life, painful things that we've been through, relationships that have been broken, things that we now believe about ourselves that are not true to God's truth about us. It could also be just the dirt of our own garden variety sin, things that we've been carrying that are weighing us down, that are burdening us, that fill us with shame, that we just need it washed away. We need that this morning. And so the story, picking up in verse 1, it says, before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. We're starting already to get a picture of what this is about. There's a little bit of double entendre happening here where he says he loves them to the end. Yes, it means that he loves them to the fullest extent possible. But it also demonstrates that he is going to love them to the very end of his life. Even in the manner of how he dies is going to demonstrate his love for his disciples and for us. He's going to love us with everything he's got, with every moment of his life, even to the end. And if you don't hear me say anything else this morning, hear me say that Jesus loved you to the very end. With everything he's got, with the manner of his death, he loved you to the very end, to the fullest extent possible. Verse 2, it says, now when it was time for supper, the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Think about this moment. Jesus is with his disciples. They are sitting around this table, and Jesus is about to get up and wash the disciples' feet. Imagine being Judas in this moment. He knows that he's going to betray Jesus, and Jesus is going to stoop down and wash his feet. You may be thinking this morning that Jesus only cares about those who have got their life in order. Only cares about those who get things right, who already have it together, who haven't screwed it all up. And I want you to know that's not true. Let this story be evidence to the contrary of that Jesus loves you too. Judas, who would betray Jesus into the hands of his accusers, Jesus washed his feet and loved him to the end, just like everyone else at that table. Jesus didn't come to Judas and sprinkle a little water on his feet obligatorily and move on. He stopped. He washed. He rubbed the dirt off his feet. He rinsed them and he dried them with care because he loved Judas as well. Verse 3, Jesus knew that the Father had given him everything, or had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God and that he was going back to God. This could be sort of what we feel like a throwaway statement that John adds in here, but I think it's actually adding powerful context to what is happening in this passage. What John is doing in this one verse is summarizing the entirety of what Jesus does in his life, his death, and his resurrection. By coming and living as a human, God put everything of himself into Jesus. Fully God, fully man. He came from God, and through his death and resurrection, he was going back to God. Now think about this for a moment. God has given him the power and capacity to do anything and everything. And what does Jesus choose to do in this moment? Verse 4, he got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel and tied around himself. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to dry them with the towel tied around him. Jesus, the one who God had entrusted with everything, who had the power to do everything and anything, stoops down in the role of a servant. Theophilus of Alexandria, writing in the 5th century, expounds on this passage, kind of talking about the greater significance of what this story is telling us about what Jesus is doing in this moment. And so this is kind of summarizing his statements, but he says essentially, he who was clothed with light, talking about Jesus, girded himself with a towel. He who held the waters in the clouds now pours water into a basin. He who gathered the water into the seas now washes the feet of the disciples. He who measured heaven with his hand's span and holds the earth in his grasp now uses those same hands to wipe the dirt from the feet of his disciples. He for whom every knee bends of those in heaven and on earth and under the earth now bows his neck to attend to servants. In other words, what Jesus is doing now is a picture of what Jesus is going to do, not only for the disciples, but for the whole world. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as well, takes this and expounds on it and talks about how Jesus removes his outer garments just as he would be stripped of his clothes to be placed on a cross. As he poured water into a basin to clean his disciples' feet, so he would pour out his blood for our purification. When he was dead, he would be wrapped in a linen cloth like the towel tied around his waist to dry their feet. And he did this not only for those who loved them, but also for the one who would betray him. Reminding us of what Paul tells us in Romans 5:8, but God proves his lone love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Why would washing their feet be such a demonstration of God going to the bitter end to love his disciples? Well, there's a couple of things for you to know about foot washing, and in particular, foot washing at this time. Now, we all know, feet are kind of gross. That's not a surprise. The idea of washing someone's feet, that does feel kind of gross. But in their day and age, it was typical for someone to offer a basin of water for people when they come in their home to wash their own feet. And in some context, they would have a slave wash the feet of guests. But washing someone's feet was considered one of the most demeaning tasks that one could have. In fact, Jews in this day would not even have their own Jewish slaves wash their feet, but they reserved this for non-Jewish slaves. And so Jesus, who contains within himself all the glory of heaven, stoops down to perform a task too demeaning even for their Jewish slaves. The second thing to know is I want you to think for a moment about the disciples' feet. Think about how they traveled up and down these dusty roads in leather sandals. Imagine how gross your feet would be in leather sandals, sweating all day. Add to that the fact that they're walking on the same roads that animals traveled, and they didn't stop on the side of the road. They just kept going as those animals took care of business. Do you smell what I'm stepping in? And then lastly, the washing of the feet of a servant by their master or by their teacher is not attested anywhere else, as far as we know, in Jewish or Greco-Roman sources. This was a singular event. Furthermore, what notion of a God in any other religion or mythology has a God perform such a humble task? This was going to the bitter end to demonstrate his love for his disciples. The South African theologian Andrew Murray, talking about the humility of Jesus, I love the way he describes it. He says that the humility of Jesus is like water. It always seeks and fills the lowest place. That's what we see Jesus doing in this moment. Verse 6, it says, he came to Simon Peter, who asked him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I am doing you don't realize now, but afterward you will understand. After what? After what will they understand? They can't fully understand what Jesus is doing right now until after Jesus' death and resurrection. There's several points in John's gospel where John is narrating an event, But then he adds on that later the disciples remembered this and understood. Meaning that there were certain things that Jesus did during his life that the disciples could not fully understand until after his death and his resurrection. And Jesus is communicating this is another one of those moments where you won't fully understand all that I am doing in this moment until after the cross. And so what Jesus is going to do for them on the cross will help them understand what he's doing now, even as the cross will clarify what Jesus was doing in washing their feet. This event anticipates what Jesus is going to do for them on the cross. Do I have any fans of Princess Bride? The Princess Bride in here? Anybody seen this movie? Yes, I love it. Love this movie. So many good things. Even reading the summary this morning, I was like, I need to go watch this movie this afternoon. But it's the story of a grandfather who is reading a fairy tale to his grandson. And it's this fairy tale about a woman or a family that has this farm. And the daughter of this family begins to fall in love with their farm hand, this farm boy, and she calls him the farm boy. And whenever she goes to the farm boy and asks him to do something, his response is always, as you wish. And so she'll say, go and fetch me. And he'll say, as you wish. And go and get me this, as you wish. And the story goes on. He leaves and goes on some adventures. And then later in the story, they come back together. And what you find out at the end of the story is that every time he said, as you wish, what he was really saying was, I love you. Every time he was putting on display that he loved her. And the same is true of this story where Jesus is washing their feet. He's communicating so much more than they can fully understand about what he is about to do for them. And so with the rest of our time, I want to name two things that Jesus does for us in the cross that this story anticipates, about what it tells us about Jesus has done for you and me. The first thing that this story tells us about what Jesus has done for you and me is that Jesus was exposed to cover our shame. It says that Jesus takes out his outer garment. Now, we don't know exactly what all that entails, but there's some sense of taking something off, much like he would do in the cross. One of the things that you can't depict in movies is the fact that Jesus was crucified naked. He was exposed as a way of embarrassing criminals, that it wasn't enough that they were just in pain and dying, but it was shameful. This idea of shame that we are introduced to at the very beginning of Scripture in Genesis, when Adam and Eve committed the first sin, they became aware of their nakedness, and they covered themselves with fig leaves. And the reason I go back to this is because shame continues to tell the same story now, which is that there is some part of you that's not okay. There's some part of you that is bad, and you better not let anyone else see it. You better not let anybody else know about it, because it will change how they think about you. It will change how they see you. It will make you less valuable, less worthy of love. You will be humiliated. They will think less of you. You will be exposed. Shame continues to tell the same story. But Jesus on the cross is stripped naked. Jesus, the new Adam, the new Adam who has come to fix what the first Adam broke, is uncovered and exposed. And all of our shame, which I think is ultimately about our fear that some part of us is bad and is deserving of judgment, Jesus is exposed, and his punishment was the outcome that we all feared. We fear that in our shame, those that are closest to us will betray us if they really know us. That we'll be rejected by those that we love. That we'll experience public condemnation and ultimately some kind of punishment. But Jesus' exposure means that we will never face our ultimate exposure. That he experienced all of that in our place, on our behalf. And we may still experience humiliations, betrayals, rejections, and condemnations, but none of that will ever be the final word on us, Because the final word is that shame is covered and ultimately removed. Jesus was exposed to cover our shame. The second thing that this story tells us about what Jesus has done for us is that Jesus poured out to wash us clean. Jesus poured out to wash us clean. As I was thinking about this passage this week, one of the things that I really wrestled with is the way that the language of clean and pure are terms that have been misused, especially within religious circles and faith circles. These terms of clean and pure have been used to manipulate and condemn and to judge and to shame. But I want you to know, and I want to fill this out for you a little bit this morning, that in Scripture, clean is not a purely moral term. In the Old Testament, clean, this language of cleanliness had to do with preparedness to come into God's presence. And so people were unclean or unprepared to enter God's presence because of things that were not necessarily sins. Maybe they had come into contact with blood or other bodily fluids. For example, a woman on her period could not enter the holy place, but it wasn't because that's a sin. And so there were times where this had to do more with hygiene. Other times it had to do with avoiding contagious illnesses. At other times it was about refraining from things as a show of devotion to God, but it wasn't a purely moral category. In cleanness or in purity, we are in our state as humans as God intended us to be, unstained by the world, undistracted from everything else, and undefiled. I was trying to think of a good analogy for this week and think of how I could explain why this isn't purely kind of a moral category. And what I came to was my love for brownies. I love brownies. I love to cook brownies, and I love to cook them because I love to undercook them. I love when they're a little gooey. I joke that when I'm 90 years old, I don't have to put my dentures in to eat them. I can just go at them. I love brownies, but I'll tell you what I don't love. I don't love nuts in my brownies. They are not intended to be made that way, at least as far as I'm concerned. And so at their best, brownies are not defiled by nuts. So if I make some brownies and I bring them to an event and you come in deciding, you know what, I got my walnuts, I'm going to shove some walnuts in his brownies, and I find out about it, you better believe I'm going to purify my brownies of those nuts before I eat them. I don't want those brownies in my presence if they've got nuts. You and I were created in God's image. And what that means is that God put certain things in us. There's something that God wanted in us to reflect Him, to reflect His image in the world. But the things that we mentioned at the beginning, the lies that the world tells us about ourselves, the stories our experiences tell us about who we are, the dirt of our own sin, all of that distorts that image in us. And sometimes we need the grime of the world washed off. When we look at feet washing in the Bible, like I mentioned, a lot of time it refers to a host providing water for their guests to wash their hands and feet before dinner. But one of the other places that we see foot washing is in certain ceremonial context, where people were required to wash their feet before they entered the tent of meeting. We see this with Moses and Aaron, where they had to wash their feet before they entered the tent of meeting where God's presence dwelt. It was a way of preparing for entering God's presence. Another option or another example of this washing is that when a person made a sacrifice in the Old Testament, for example, if they made a sacrifice to receive God's forgiveness, the blood of that animal represented the life that was given because sin always leads to death. And so in this case, the animal's life is sacrificed in the person's place. However, What is also a part of this process is that in order to prepare the sacrifice to be brought into God's presence, certain parts of that animal also had to be washed. This washing was necessary. It was a necessary step before the offering could be presented on the altar, symbolizing the need for cleanliness in the presence of God. What Jesus is going to do on the cross is pour out his blood as the life that is lost in our place. But there's something else that Jesus is also doing. Something else that only John tells us about. This is unique to John. And what I love about this is that John was the only disciple at the cross. But John is the only gospel that tells us about how when Jesus was on the cross, his side was pierced with a spear, and both blood and water poured out. Now, there's been lots of scientific explanations given to this and to why this would have happened, but what I love is the theological significance of this. That not only he pours out his blood to replace ours, but he pours out water to wash us clean and to prepare us to enter the presence of God. Or rather, for God's presence to enter us. He's preparing us to be recipients of his presence by his Spirit. We know that the veil of the temple is torn, not only symbolizing that all are welcome in God's presence, but also symbolizing that God's presence is no longer confined to the temple in Jerusalem, but it's breaking out into your life and mine. Jesus was preparing us to be temples where God would dwell by his Spirit. And so what the foot washing tells us about what Jesus would do is that it was to cover over our shame and to wash us free of all that distorts the image of God in us. He is washing us to restore us. As this encounter goes on and the story goes on, verse 8, it says, "You will never wash my feet," Peter said. Jesus replied, "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." One who has bathed, Jesus told him, doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he is completely clean. I love that Peter's like, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus is like, "Look, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have a part with me." He's like, "Okay, then wash everything." There's a part of me that I read stories like this and I wonder, did Jesus ever have to look at Peter and just say, "Peter, just stop talking. Just stop. You're going to ruin the moment." But what this tells us is that, like Peter, many of us have chosen to follow Jesus. Many of us have received his love, have committed our life to following him, and in that we have been washed. And yet it's also true that there are times where we still need our feet washed. We need the stuff that the world puts on us, that's weighing us down, that's carrying us, that's taking our journey in some bad directions. We need that washed off of our feet. But there are also some of us who have never taken that step to follow Jesus, have never walked through the waters of baptism and had our whole lives washed clean. The invitation this morning is for all of us. For those of us in the room who have taken that step and are following Jesus, I want to invite you this morning to just let Jesus wash your feet. And maybe you need to take some time and not be too proud to let Jesus wash your feet. For others of us, I want to invite you, if you've never taken that step to follow Jesus, or maybe you've taken the step to follow Jesus but never been through the waters of baptism, today is the day to make that decision. Maybe you've been trying to walk this by yourself. Maybe you've tried to push your shame aside and cover it yourself, but no matter how hard you do, you can't do it on your own. And it's time to let Jesus do it for you. I want to invite us all now to just bow our heads. And wherever you find yourself this morning, if you need Jesus to come and wash your feet, just invite him to do it. Say, Jesus, I've believed some things about myself that aren't true, and I need you to wash it away. I've been some places on my journey. I brought some dirt on my feet, and Jesus, I need you to wash it away. Jesus, I'm carrying some pain and some brokenness, and it's weighing me down, and it's heavy, and I need you to wash it off. Would you invite Jesus to do that? For others of us who've never made that decision to follow Jesus, today is the day. You realize you don't have to try to cover your own shame. He has covered it for you. You don't have to try to deal with all the things in your own life that leave you feeling heavy and burdened, full of shame. He's come to wash it away. Today's the day to decide to enter the waters of baptism and be washed. As you continue to pray, we're going to have our prayer team available. If you would like somebody to pray with you, they'll be available on the sides. But let's just take a moment and meet with Jesus.